Let's talk about one of the most important skills in all of jiu-jitsu, and interestingly, one of the most difficult to teach. I'll explain why. Why it's difficult to teach will tell you a lot about the very nature of the skill itself. The skill we're looking at is the skill of retaining your guard against resistance. The sport of jiu-jitsu is predicated on a pretty simple insight that whenever we work from bottom position, I always want to keep my legs between myself and my opponent. Okay, so if Mateus is working against me and he's in a top position and I'm in bottom position, one of the basic precepts of the sport of jiu-jitsu is that I always want my legs as an intermediary between my upper body and his upper body. Anytime my legs shift out of alignment and now there's no real barrier between his upper body and my upper body, warning signs are going off in the sport of jiu-jitsu. That gets worse and worse as his upper body gets closer and closer to mine, until a crisis is reached around here where my opponent has actually passed my legs and would have scored points, and you are now officially behind in the sport. So there's this basic demand in the sport of jiu-jitsu that our legs must always be between ourselves and our opponent. If that should ever fail to be the case, the first thing we have to do is bring our legs back in. The entire bottom game of jiu-jitsu is based around this simple insight. The more I can retain that situation or maintain that situation where my legs are between myself and my opponent, despite his best attempts to get past my legs, the more success you're going to have. Now, when we go to teach the skill of guard retention, there's two big ways in which we can do this. There's two schools of thought, as it were, on how we can do this. The first, and in my opinion, the most important, is a general theory of guard retention. I'll explain why I believe this is the most important way of understanding guard retention. Guard passing as a skill is one of the most dynamic and rapid moving of all the scenarios in which a jiu-jitsu player finds himself. If I'm working from my back and my opponent is standing over me, as he goes to pass my guard from here, things can happen very, very quickly. There's rapid changes in direction, movement as we fight, and there's changes from one side to the other. There's changes in levels where my opponent comes down to a lower level, and we find ourselves in situations where only one leg is controlled. Sometimes it's two legs controlled. And things happen very, very quickly, very, very rapidly. There's a lot of side-to-side dynamic movement. So it's difficult to teach jiu-jitsu in this context compared with, say, for example, an armbar scenario where you have your opponent bolted down to the floor and you're going through a step-by-step procedure to separate your opponent's arms and ultimately to break it. There are certain scenarios in jiu-jitsu where movement is tightly controlled, and as a result, you can go through the more algorithmic approach to the skills involved. But it's difficult to apply rigid algorithms to guard maintenance simply because the task at hand changes so quickly and so dynamically that you can't really give concrete step-by-step procedures. What you can give is general guidelines. There's going to have to be some improvisation on your part. But as I said, just because of the very nature of the sport, the rapid changes, the dynamic movement, we're going to be looking to give you a very sort of general idea about what we ought to be doing at any given moment. But we're going to avoid, at least in this first approach to guard retention, giving you very, very strict step-by-step approaches as to what we ought to do. That's the first, and in my opinion, the most important form of understanding guard retention, to give you a set of concepts, a set of axioms that guide behavior with rules of thumb. The second approach to guard retention is a much more set, well-defined set of criteria for specific positions. There are different ways an opponent can go to pass my guard. So I'll run through some of the more well-known ones. My opponent can go underneath both of my legs and from here work with what is often referred to as double underguard passes. My opponent can take one of my legs and put it through into so-called over underguard passes, where he works in positions like these. These are pretty well worked out situations. My opponent stands up, gets a hold of, stands up and gets a hold of both of my gi pants and go into variations of Toreando guard passes. Okay, these are scenarios in which we find ourselves in which we can identify the specific guard pass my opponent is using. Understand something. Each type of guard pass has its good features and its bad features. It has its strengths and its weaknesses. One way I can learn to retain guard is to identify what form of guard pass my opponent is using and go into a set of specific countermeasures designed to negate that particular form of guard pass. This too can be a very effective method of learning to retain guard. So what have we got here? We've got a fundamental dichotomy in the game of retaining guard. We can go with a generalist approach in which we try to give you broad generalizations, axioms, basic ideas and concepts which will work against any form of guard pass. This, in my opinion, is the best one for you to focus on because it will give you the ability to adapt to rapidly changing conditions and criteria which you find yourself in a genuine competitive guard pass situation. The second approach is to identify the specific guard pass that is being used against you and to use a pretty well set out set of protocols to negate and ultimately overcome that specific guard pass. So those are the two directions that guard retention can go. A generalist approach in which we try to give general principles, general ideals to work against any form of guard pass in a dynamic, fast-moving situation, and a specific approach where we identify what kind of guard pass is being used against us and work specifically against that, negate it, and overcome it. Those two general approaches to guard retention will be the subject that we look at today. I do favor, especially in fundamentals stage of development, a more generalist approach. I believe most people should spend most of their time working on that. But there's a lot to be said for a more specific approach where we identify what kind of guard pass is being used against us and fight specifically against that. I will show both, but I'm going to begin with a generalist approach since I consider it to be the more useful at fundamentals level jiu-jitsu. When we begin our study of guard retention, the general theory of guard retention, there are two absolutely fundamental requirements on our part as the guard player if we're going to retain our guard against resistance. If we have an opponent standing over us or on TV, it doesn't really matter. Any time we're in a situation like this, the two most fundamental requirements on our part are movement and connection. If my opponent makes a move to an angle and starts to come around outside of my legs, if I have neither movement nor connection to my opponent, it's only a matter of time, and usually a very short time, until he passes my guard. Okay? So there's a sense in which we can prevent our opponent from passing through one of two elements, movement or connection. If I have a foot connected to my opponent, nothing else, just a foot, and my opponent goes to walk in this direction, that connection means that wherever he goes, I will follow. I can do similar things with a foot in my training partner's arm, just like so. Again, the only form of connection I have to Mateus is a foot in my training partner's bicep. When he goes to walk in this direction, just that simple connection to my opponent's body means that as he goes to move, he won't pass. Rather, I will stay aligned with my training partner. The most fundamental choice that we have as the bottom player when it comes to connecting to our opponent is always the choice between connecting at the arms, which can be done in many different ways, and connecting at the legs, which also can be done in many different ways. But what they all have in common is the sense in which once that connection is made, as my opponent goes to form an angle on me, we are connected to them. And as a result, they won't be able to pass our guard so easily. Okay? The second element, if I don't have connection, then I have to have movement. Here, I have no connection to my opponent. If he makes a move to an angle on me and I fail to do anything, of course he's going to pass my guard. But if my opponent goes in and I start, say, for example, an action of scooting, that's a very basic form of movement. It keeps my opponent in front of me. Remember, our goal, whenever we go to retain guard, is to keep our two center lines lined up with each other. As long as my center line faces my opponent's center line, he's in my guard. My leg's going to be between us. The moment he veers off, and now my center line no longer faces my opponent, I must move in such a way that I realign my center line with him. Okay? And the two ways in which we can do this are either movement or some form of connection. Here, I have my center line aligned with my opponent. If he goes to move around me now, because I have a basic form of connection to him, our center lines stay aligned. Okay? So in this sense, the two most fundamental demands upon us as the bottom athlete will always be movement and connection. I must have at least one of those two things, and preferably both of them, if I'm going to retain my guard against my opponent's attempts to get around my legs. Somewhere along the line, whenever we're in any kind of guard retention scenario, our primary goal is to work with the two concepts of movement and connection to put our opponent in a situation where he cannot easily blow past our legs and score points upon us. Now, presumably, if you bought this video, you already know guard retention is an important thing. But let's outline exactly why I want it to be such a big part of your development as a jiu-jitsu athlete. We have a training partner down in front of us. There's a sense in which if my opponent has a strong ability to retain guard, there's certain things that I simply cannot do as the top athlete, the passing athlete. If my opponent has strong guard retention skills, immediately he denies certain things to me. Most of the high percentage finishes when we work within the rule system, using the jacket and the gi, are upper body finishes. And as long as I cannot pass my opponent's legs, I will forever be denied access to the most high percentage finishes for gi jiu-jitsu. So if we're working here down on the floor and my opponent's doing a good job of tying in and I simply cannot get past my opponent's legs, the only kinds of opportunities for submission that I'm ever going to have are going to be lower body submissions. And as a general rule, the lower body submissions when we work with a jacket on a somewhat less high percentage than those when we work without a jacket. Moreover, many of the defenses are augmented by the fact that my opponent can access my lapels, access my gi pants, and generally has, in some ways, not always, but in some ways, easier times defending leg attacks. So I've lost the entire category of upper body submissions, and it condemns me to only attacking 50% of my opponent's body. That's a terrible, terrible thing. In addition, not only do I get expelled from attacking the upper body, but I also lose access to the single most high percentage attacking position in the sport of jiu-jitsu, which is the back. Okay, if you can get behind people in the sport of jiu-jitsu, this is a huge, huge event. From here, you have a definite dominance in position. Okay, this is probably, all things considered, the single most dominant position if we're in a grappling situation. And as long as my opponent has his legs between myself and he, I can never access the back. Okay, I can't get to the upper body at all, and I can't get to the back in particular. So guard retention is such a big deal because my opponent, if he can forever retain his guard against my best attempts to pass, will always keep me away from the upper body and the single best attacking position in the sport. That's why guard retention is such a big part of your development as you go through the sport of jiu-jitsu. It's such a security on your part to know that you can keep your opponent away from the most high percentage methods of attack. There's other considerations too. There's some tactical considerations. If I do pass my training partner's guard, if I get some kind of guard pass from here and we work our way through and I score upon my opponent, this puts me in a situation where the rules of jiu-jitsu are such that my opponent is now in a points deficit. There is no referee intervention to ensure that I stay aggressive after I've gained a lead. So once I get to a situation like this, and I know I'm ahead on points, I can simply ride out the end of the match in this pin. No one's going to intervene. No one's going to take me out of position. I can just stay here. Even if my opponent did put me back in guard, I can now play a very conservative game inside my opponent's guard and just hunker down, stay in close, and just stall things out until time goes by. Okay, and it's very, very hard for my opponent now to go into attacks on someone who's gone into a deliberate stalling position where they've retracted their limbs and simply hunkered down until time runs out. Once someone gains a points advantage in the sport of jiu-jitsu, it's very, very hard to go to attack them from that moment on. Compare this to a situation where we're either equivalent in points or I'm behind. Now I need to take risks. Okay, if it's 0-0 or I'm down on points, I've got to take risks to win. And those risks will make me more susceptible to attack. So, for example, if I'm fighting hard to go in here and pass and he's fighting hard to go in for submissions, it's a dogfight now. And we're working hard to score points on each other. But if I already know that I'm ahead, I'm much more inclined now to take very few risks and simply knuckle down, tie down, and now I'm a much more difficult person to score upon. So as a general rule, the athlete who scores first, usually with a guard pass, has a significant advantage for the remaining time of the match. So that's just one more reason why guard retention is such an important skill in the sport of jiu-jitsu. Because if someone does pass our guard and gets up on points, it's going to be hard to pull back in the time remaining against someone who no longer has an incentive to actively engage us and take risks. So considerations like these really solidify this idea why it's so important for you as a developing student to develop your guard retention skills. But ultimately, the most important thing I want you focusing on with regards to the importance of guard retention has to do with the relationship between offense and defense in the sport of jiu-jitsu. Even though skills like pin escapes and guard retention are often seen as defensive skills, it's very important to understand that these defensive skills, such as guard retention, are a means to an end. And that end is always attack. The end study of jiu-jitsu is to create in you an attacking, positive athlete who goes forward to positively engage with your opponent and win in the most decisive fashion possible, which is submission. That's always the long-term goal. But interestingly, it's very difficult to get students to push towards that goal if they're constantly worried about taking risks. If I'm always worried about getting my guard passed and getting pinned, it's very unlikely that I'm going to engage in any kind of real risky behavior and attack my opponent in a positive fashion. So the first thing I always look to do as a coach of developing athletes is to get them very, very strong in guard retention and pin escapes. Because only when students are strong in these two areas will they have the psychological confidence to go forward and play a positive attacking game. When they have absolute faith in their ability to hold a guard for long periods of time, they will attack from the guard. But if they're constantly worried about getting their guard passed, they will have a tendency to hold on to the guard without ever taking a risk and actually going out and attacking their opponent. There's also a simple time equation here. If someone goes to pass my guard, it's going to take time for me to escape from a pin and get back on the attack. Notice that in the sport of jiu-jitsu, almost all of the high percentage of attacks involve the use of my legs. So if someone has passed my legs and is pinning me, there are no real attacks from here. There has to be an escape first, and attacks are going to have to come after that. Now, if my opponent has any skills, he's going to be able to hold me there for a considerable period of time before I actually do get out. And only when I can finally bring my legs back between us can I now start engaging in attacks once again. So what happens is, if people are consistently passing your guard more often than they ought to be, you're spending too much of your time in these defensive positions from where offense is not possible. When you have strong guard retention skills, you're going to be the athlete who can attack from bottom position through the duration of a match without any interference, without any lag time where you're simply trying to fight your way out of pins. And these are the considerations why I put such a high emphasis upon guard maintenance in developing athletes. I always say to my students, as a beginning student in jiu-jitsu, your first two goals are always mastery of pin escapes, so no one can hold you down for extended periods of time, and two, guard retention, so that no one can put you in situations where you're constantly fighting out of bad positions rather than attacking from good ones. So let's be clear. Let's make your goal as a developing student in line with these: master of pin escapes and master of guard retention. Those are the first two goals that I always set for my students, and those are the first two goals I want you to set for yourself. Okay, we know that the bottom game in Jiu-Jitsu is entirely built around the idea of guard position. The idea is that if we're going to be in bottom position in any combat situation, we always want our legs between ourselves and our opponent, so we can use them in both defensive and offensive fashion to win from bottom position. That's the core belief of the entire sport of Jiu-Jitsu. We've seen that when someone goes to actively get past our legs, we need to use the combined effects of movement and connection to make that very difficult for them. The entire study of what we do in this guard retention program is going to be based around how we're going to move and how we're going to connect to our opponent in order to prevent them from passing. Now, there's a few sins in the sport of Jiu-Jitsu, which, like any sin, will get you in trouble. For example, back exposure. Okay, the sport of Jiu-Jitsu is extremely unforgiving towards back exposure. I can make many mistakes in the sport of Jiu-Jitsu, but one I can't make is to expose my back to my opponent. It just makes it so easy for him to get advantages over me and ultimately to finish me. When it comes time to retain guard, there's also an unforgivable sin. And if you lapse into this, people will immediately find it rather easy to pass your guard. And this is the sin of chest exposure. When you think about it, Mateus is standing over me. No matter how much angle Mateus gets upon me, and no matter how much level change downwards Mateus makes, he'll never pass my guard so long as my knee and elbow are together. Because my knee and my elbow form a frame that prevents any exposure of my chest. Guard retention is essentially the skill of ensuring that you never expose your chest to your opponent. The moment my knee and elbow start to drift apart, suddenly, as I present my chest to my opponent, he's going to start passing my guard. Okay? So everything that we do when it comes time to retain guard is designed to prevent my chest being exposed to his chest. Always, we want barriers between my chest and his upper body. So even as he gets into a good passing position, we want to form some kind of barrier, whether it be with the legs to prevent chest exposure, or a combination of legs and arms to prevent chest exposure, and in an emergency situation, even just an arm in itself. But there's always got to be something between his chest and my chest. Okay? We can never have an unprotected chest where there's nothing, no intermediary between my chest and his, and my chest now becomes exposed to my opponent. Always there has to be the combination of legs and arms, or even an arm in itself to prevent that chest exposure. If you focused just on that idea that you would never expose your chest willingly to an opponent, and you just had that simple mental conception in your head as you rolled and sparred with your opponents, you will find that fewer people pass your guard. It's that simple. Remember, ultimately, every failure to retain your guard against resistance is ultimately down to one thing. You exposed your chest to your opponent's chest. In some cases, it's also exposure of your opponent's knee to your stomach. So if my opponent comes around the corner, and if his knee goes to my stomach here, this too can count as a guard pass. But this happens on fewer occasions than chest-to-chest exposure. This is the vast majority of guard passes occur in this context. So whether it's chest-to-chest or chest-to-knee, we can never have that form of exposure. There always has to be this barrier in the way at all times. And those barriers are either my opponent moves to the side, my legs and arms combined, or in an emergency, just a hand by itself and just my arms. But what I can never have is a situation where my chest is exposed and my knee and elbows come together, sorry, far apart, and my opponent falls into the gap that I have created. There can never be this unfilled gap between my elbows and my knees, which exposes my chest to my opponent and makes it easy for him to pass my guard. And so the fundamental, unforgivable sin of guard retention is the act of a jiu-jitsu player who willingly exposes their chest to their opponent in the middle of a guard passing scramble. You must always, 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 always focus on this simple goal to always create a situation where there is some barrier between your chest and your opponent's chest, between your chest and, in some cases, his knee. Focus upon that as your primary directive whenever you're looking to retain guard, and right from the start, your opponents will find it more difficult to get around your legs and into a pin. Okay, we're starting to get further into the general theory of guard retention. Let's understand that there are three fundamental postures that you need to start to work with if you're going to retain guard against highly skilled guard passers. You must be able to go effortlessly, smoothly, and efficiently from one of these postures to the other two and back and forth in exchanges. These three postures will be seated guard situations, okay, where I'm in a seated position, my chest is over my knee line, and we work like so. There are two basic choices when we work from a seated situation. You have square seated situations and staggered seated situations, where you have a hand on the floor and one foot in front of the other. Typically, your other hand is using some kind of pushing, framing, posting kind of action. So once again, if we're seated, we are either square, like so, or we're staggered, like so, okay? The second fundamental posture that we work with in guard retention will be supine guards. Now, obviously, there are many forms of guard where we're flat on our back. Supine just needs to be on your back. And from here, we go to work typically with our legs, arms, framing, etc., etc. And the third fundamental posture will be turtle position, where we take a defensive structure where instead of having our back on the ground, we have our body in a prone position with knees and elbows on the floor. And from here, we learn to work in a defensive fashion. As long as my opponent doesn't have his hooks in, he doesn't score points. And structurally, it's a pretty strong position. It's a good, strong defensive position to work from. All guard retention works between those three postures. And you must be able to smoothly go from one to the other. If I have an opponent in front of me, and from here, he quickly steps around to an angle. As he moves further and further around past the line of my hips, my back is starting to get exposed to him. If I stay here and he continues around behind me, my back will have been exposed. That's a disaster. Okay? So as my opponent comes around to a given side, it's very, very important that I be able to throw my back to the ground so there's no back exposure to him. If the ground's on my back, then he's not on my back. And then from this situation, we can start to bring the legs back in. As my opponent throws my legs to the side and goes in to pass my guard in situations like this, pass my guard, there can often be situations where we can turn in on our training partner and come up to a turtle position. As he now spins around behind me from turtle situation, we could always roll back into guard later on. And so you will see that almost all guard retention scrambles involve the constant use of those three fundamental positions. You must make a deep, deep study of these three fundamental postures and the ability to go smoothly, quickly, and efficiently from one to the other. I cannot overstate the importance of constantly drilling these three positions. Even in solo fashion, we'll be looking at that very shortly. But ultimately, if you cannot use any one of those three, but only use one or two of them instead of all three in unison, your guard retention skills will never match up to what your potential was. In order to maximize your potential in guard retention, you have to be highly effective in all three postures and the transitions between the three.